and I have no spare time at the moment. But I do still manage to get yoga in, although the others sort of seem to go by the wayside. So thank you everyone for asking me to be here this morning. It was a pleasure to be invited back, and I understand that the speakers who are presenting to you today are highlights from SOPAC, so it is a real pleasure to be able to be part of that group, and it's a pleasure to see so many people here. It's interesting looking through the list of attendees how many of you have risk in your title, and I think it plays to the fact that these days there's a recognition that risk management, risk awareness, risk management and risk outcomes are fundamental to the world of assurance and internal audit, but they're fundamental really to the outcomes for organisations. So today we're going to talk a bit about risk appetite, and largely I'm going to talk about that from my perspective as a member of a board and what it means for a board member, what's hard about it, what's good about it, and then how professionals like yourselves can actually help boards and management do better when it comes to the defining of the risks that are acceptable in an organisation. The one thing I'm not going to do is hand out risk management statements that are risk appetite statements that you can all go away and copy. It isn't that easy. So if that was an expectation, I apologise in advance. In the session paper, it said that we'd cover these topics, and we will, but probably not in a discrete order. So hopefully as you listen to the presentation, you'll be able to take some snippets away that will be useful for you in your organisation. The presentation will be available. I'm also happy to make the notes available later if Institute so desires. Sorry, I should say also before we start, this is me managing my own risk appetite. I'm due at North Sydney at 12:30, and we will absolutely be finishing this session just a little after 12. So what is risk appetite? It's defined widely these days as the amount and type of risk an organisation is willing to accept, which is an important word, in pursuit of its objectives. Now that definition has largely evolved out of the financial services regulators and the application by financial services organisations of regulation and the requirements of regulators to have risk appetite statements. It's interesting that in ISO 31000, it's not actually described as part of the framework itself. It is in the guidance notes, but the two are not very well connected in the standard itself, and I think that's some place that this group of people could actually influence to get that connectivity made, which is literally the connectivity between strategy and operations. So in this slide, what I've attempted to do is show the two sides of a coin, strategy and risk appetite. So all organisations are very well versed with the concept of capital, strategic planning, strategic goals, business plans, performance reviews, KPIs, business performance monitoring. It's all like bread and butter for most organisations. But the other side of that coin is risk appetite. So what is our risk capacity to take on the things that we've decided that we're going to do? How much and when and what do we want to do? So what is our appetite for our strategic goals? I've seen any number of strategic plans that are yay long and yay thick, but nothing helps the organisation decide what comes first, what has a greater priority, what should be invested in over something else, when should that be done, what extra resource do we need to take on. That's what risk appetite does. And risk appetite is purely the domain of the board. It's for the board to decide how much or how little, when or when not, and what's the results we're looking for out of that effort. Once you understand your risk appetite, you can set risk profile or understand the risk profile of the organisation. And then through risk tolerance, you can align them, right? So you can decide then, is my risk profile actually more? Have I taken on more risk than my risk appetite? Have I taken on less risk? Have I taken on risks in areas that actually I don't want to be in, but I didn't sit down and think about it through the lens of risk appetite? So by using a risk lens to your strategic process, you can get a much better outcome in terms of management understanding what the board's willing to take on for the organisation. Now, I know there's lots of people sitting in the room who are from government organisations or councils or whatever, and this concept applies equally in those organisations. Nobody's in business not to take on risk. Hands up the people in the room whose business takes on no risk. Right, so we all take on risk, all of our businesses take on risk. Risk appetite is about a cogent conversation to get a collegiate view and a consensus view of the board around what risks, how much risk, when will I take those risks on. So what's acceptable? So risk appetite is typically used to aid an understanding of what you will or won't do. Organisations are really good at adding things to the list and absolutely appalling at taking things off the list. Risk appetite helps you have that conversation, because I don't know any organisation, but put your hand up if you do have a money tree that just churns out money day in and day out, and there's never any limit to what you can do. Hands up. Which ones? No? So you've got to decide what not to do. It's about making strategic choices between strategic priorities. As I said, organisations are very good at coming up with strategic plans that have got lots of things on them. And typically that's because the planning process is every department head gets told, go away and come up with your strategic plan. And then we put them all together, put some staples in them and go, here's the strategic plan for the organisation. But unless you sit down and think about the relationship between the parts of that plan, what's more important in the organisation and when, by and large, I'd hypothesise that at the end of 3 years or 5 years, those plans won't have been fulfilled. Does that sound like a bit of a truism? And the reason for that is that everyone's competing for the same pie. Everyone's competing for the same people. Everyone wants more investment. Everyone wants a bigger slice of the budget. Everyone wants to try something new because that's exciting. But tragically, you can't. That's not how organisations happen. So the opportunity for you in this room is, how do you start to help your organisation through a risk lens have a different conversation? You know, if one of your roles was to look at the strategic planning process, what would you be able to, what insight would you be able to bring to the table to talk about what could be improved in that process? And that's partly where people with your qualifications and background can really influence organisations. Most importantly, risk appetite is the board's view, right? If the board aren't on board, then this won't work. And I'm going to show you in a minute why it is that even though boards think they're on board, they're not on board. Facilitates the allocation of scarce resources, allows for monitoring of the business to the limits that have been set. How much easier would your job be if you actually knew categorically what it was you were supposed to measure the business against? What success was really supposed to look like, so that you could then report against that, as opposed to, you know, sort of struggling sometimes in your roles to sort of add the value that you truly can add if you're looking at it from a strategic perspective. And risk appetite's not static, right? What it is, though, is a framework for allowing an organisation to respond to change dynamically. Because if you start, I can tell you as a board member, if you start getting reports against risk appetite that are red, and let me tell you that happens, what's the board going to do? They're not going to sit there and go, oh, that's fine. They can't. That's too risky for them. They've got to respond to the red. So then in responding to the red, you can reframe and reset. Oh, sorry, I'm just going back. So have a think. Who read the Fin Review this morning? Yesterday? The Australian? Who read a newspaper in the last 24 hours? So how many horror stories were there? How many financial, organisational horror stories were there in the paper in the last few days? Now, we can talk about ANZ, but we won't. We talk about Wesfarmers, Target. Which of those would you like to talk about? They are all examples of organisations who have suffered some bad luck, do you think? Or are they examples of organisations who weren't clear about what their risk appetite was? Are they examples of organisations who didn't monitor against an appetite, didn't see the change when it was coming so that they could respond to it? So is it bad luck or is it bad planning? So is it bad setting of expectations? I could mention a number of others, but I'm bound to insult somebody in the room, so I'm not going to. But you go, before you come here tomorrow morning, is this on again tomorrow morning? No. Okay, well, when you leave today, go pick up any newspaper and just see how many examples you can find where you sort of go, really? How could they have missed that? What were they doing? Were they asleep at the wheel? Risk appetite is about being conscious, making conscious decisions that help lead an organisation down a particular path. It doesn't mean things won't go wrong, but it does mean you're more likely to know about it sooner, and chances are you will have averted the bigger crises. And of course, the GFC was the biggest one of those. Do you think the board of Lehman Brothers sat down one day and said, it'd be really good if we went broke? It'd be really good if we all lost our jobs, our houses. Do you think that's what they thought? Well, the challenge is they possibly didn't think. They got swept away, like a lot of organisations at the time. And so the challenge, what people have learned out of that is you've got to be better than that. And so the frame to be better at that in is risk appetite. So if it's not acceptable to the board to go broke, then you've got to think about, well, what would cause that? You know, what would cause that to happen, and how are we going to avoid that happening? And I should say, risk appetite's not about avoiding everything either. It's actually about consciously thinking about the opportunities to take, but taking them knowledgeably. So before we go on to do our little mock board session, I just want to touch on a couple of terms which confuse everybody immensely because they're used interchangeably. Now, this actually is something I picked up from EY's in a presentation given by Ian Lachlan from APRA a couple of years ago. So, risk capacity. Risk capacity is about the ability to support your strategy. So it's things like money, people, technology, IP. So all the things that you need to support taking the risks that you want to take. Risk appetite is about the willingness to accept So risk appetite may be a bit broader, and generally should be broader, than risk tolerance. Risk tolerance is about the maximum amount of risk that you're willing to take. So the take word is the important word, per risk, so it's much more granular. And the risk target is the optimum level of risk you want to take per goal. So all of those sit together under the risk appetite framework. So just when you go back to your organisations and you hear people using all these terms interchangeably, try to get some discipline into how they're used so that people aren't getting confused. Okay, so appetite. So we all inherently understand risk appetite. We apply it every day in the things that we do personally. So if we have a look at these questions, I'm only going to ask a couple. So let's go to the second one. Hands up if you would post inappropriate photos of yourself on social media. Very risk adverse. Excellent. Sensible group here. So question 3, would you purchase and drive a car with faulty brakes? No? Okay. Would you jaywalk to save time? Right. So some of you would and some of you wouldn't, right? So risk appetite is personal. And you can live with your decision because, in theory, the only person affected is you. If you get fined, that's your problem. Mind you, if you cause an accident that someone swerves to avoid you, goes up a footpath, runs into a mother with a child in a pram and it gets killed, well, that's your problem also. But we are personally responsible for our appetite and we take that on board and we can. That, unfortunately, is not the case in a boardroom. So in a boardroom, you'll have somewhere between 6 and sometimes 18 erstwhile individuals trying to apply themselves diligently to the organisation's pursuits, to the expectation of its stakeholders, and to discharge their responsibilities diligently. But they're each individuals, and when they sit round that boardroom, they have a conversation with themselves. Oh, I'm not sure about that. I could do more of that. I'm not sure we should do that. So we have this little conflict going on inside each of the individuals, and around the table, just like you saw here, you'll find that some of the directors think one way and some of them think another way. You can't get a risk appetite statement for an organisation unless you get explicit agreement as to how the board collectively will respond to something or not. So we're going to do a little exercise. This is where you need your voting apps if you want to get them ready. So you've recently joined the board of an organisation. Congratulations to each and every one of them. I hope you made sure you had indemnity and D&O insurance. Most important. It stated risk appetite in the documents that you were given and that you reviewed as part of your due diligence process. Stated that risk appetite is for the growth strategy medium, for financial strategy medium, OH&S low. Overall, it stated that the board appears to have a conservative risk appetite, whatever that means. At your first board meeting, you're approving the strategy for the next 3 years. And this includes expansion of market share domestically and overseas by 10 to 30% annually for the next 5 years. Woohoo! You want to have a debt to equity ratio, forget Russian, higher than, you're prepared to accept a debt to equity ratio higher than the norm for the next 7 years to support that. You're going to beat the war on talent because you need talent desperately to deliver this strategy by paying above market rates. And you want zero OHS incidents in all jurisdictions. A consultant has been asked to help consider risk appetite and asks you a series of questions using a scale of 1 to 10. So we've got 4 questions here, and there's no right answer. It's only your answer, okay? So don't try and second guess. Don't consult with the person next to you. Your answer. So question 1, we are prepared to have a high level of debt over the long term, being 7 to 10 years. So you get to choose low, medium, high. So what's your appetite for having a high level of debt over the long term, given that strategy, as a member of the board? We answered it? Has everyone got an app, or do I need to do a show of hands? Yep, up. Right, okay. Oh, there we go. Well done. That's a pretty good outcome. Where am I going? Sorry, can you close that? I just want you to close that. So the next one, we should fund expansion from our surplus earnings and set dividend policy to nil for the next 7 years. So rather than running high debt levels, we'll keep the money that we earn and we won't pay it out to anyone, and we'll use it for our expansion activities. Vote now. Whoa. Okay. Oh, there we go. Right. Hands up all the people who own shares and like dividends. Okay, thanks. Can you close that down for me? Okay. Oh. Right. Am I going through now? Right, here we go. Only 25% of our workforce should be paid above median REM. Focus should be on non-cash incentives. Now remember what your strategic plan said. So the management came to you and said, we're going to hire the market for all of these fabulous people. What do you as a board think? Okay, we can close that. And the last one, we want a belts and braces approach where nothing ever goes wrong. Okay. Okay. So, what did we think? Lots of different views. There was no one set position for anybody on anything. So if you had a board of, let's say, 7 people, how would you go about getting some consensus around those measures? Because none of them are right or wrong, really. They're just different. And that's the real challenge, is how you sit down and have a conversation that then gets those people to harmonise across those positions. Now, I've run those exercises for organisations, and it can take several days of workshops to actually unpack what were people thinking, why were they thinking it. Okay, if we set the strategic plan too high, do we need to ratchet that back a bit? Or maybe we can do a bit of it and still have this debt. And so there's lots of conversations that have to happen to harmonise that position. So if you think of yourself as a proxy for a board, you can see there was no set answer that you all would have come up with where you just go tick. So then if you're sitting in a boardroom and you don't actually ask those questions and you don't explore what people are thinking, then the same thing happens. Decisions actually get made without being clear about what people's expectations are, what the board's expectations are. So one of the things that you can do when you go back to your organisation is you ask the question, have we done any risk appetite work? If we've done risk appetite work, who developed it? How did the directors actually sign it off? Did the directors feel comfortable that that really is their appetite? You know, the head of internal audit might well go and talk to the head of the audit committee and sort of say, I'm curious, can you help me understand how the board went about this? Because I really want to sort of see how we can support the board in their deliberations in this area. And I can assure you that even the best companies, the biggest companies that have done the most work on risk appetite, it's still early days and they're still trying to work out what the right reporting is, what the right monitoring is, what the right measures are. So if you haven't come very far along the curve, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Okay, so it was just to help you understand that you can't just walk in and go, let's have a risk appetite statement. You write it, you hand it over, someone signs it, and we all go off and we're very happy, because basically nobody will be happy. Okay, so risk appetite statements. We talked a bit about this. So they're developed by the board. It has to be a consensus view. They're dynamic and they're directional. So they can have guiding principles in them. They can say things like, well, we want to expand, but it's only if it's in these jurisdictions, or we don't cannibalise our core products, or it's done in an environmentally friendly fashion, or we do this project before we do that project. You can put all of those qualifiers into a statement of principles. It can be qualitative or quantitative. Often when you're starting out, doing it qualitatively is easier. It's easier to say things like, we want to aggressively pursue opportunity X, as opposed to sort of trying to put a whole heap of quantitative measures. It wouldn't surprise you that the appetite statement that people find easiest to quantify is the one around finances. So how much return on equity do we want? What do we want our profitability to be? How much of the balance sheet are we prepared to put at risk? Organisations find that easy to define. They find other things much harder to define. An easy way to embed risk appetite is make it part of business process approvals. No one gets anything approved unless it's got something on it that says this is how it fits within risk appetite. It forces a real discipline in the organisation, because it often means that groups in the organisation have to work together and collaborate to put up one business plan that benefits the whole rather than individual parts of the organisation. So people say, we have to embed risk appetite. That's a simple way, well, it sounds simple. In one of my organisations, it probably took us 3 years to get to that point. But now that we've got it working, it works really well. And it's used for performance monitoring. So are we within appetite? Aren't we within appetite? What does that mean? What does it mean when you get the traffic lights and you're amber? What does that mean? What do I do about it? What does the board do about it? So if you're going to use a traffic light system, you've got to at least thought about some measures that you can put in place that make some sense. So what can the content be? I've seen risk appetite statements that are 2 pages and 200 pages, right? So one of them, on one extreme, they're bare bones, they're just trying to get the organisation started on the journey. And on the other side, they're totally encapsulating. You know, they've got purpose, they've got a business overview, they talk about the strategy, they talk about the market positions and conditions, talk about the risk framework and how appetite fits into the risk framework, posture definition, so low, medium, high. What does low, medium, high mean? Or another would be conservative and neutral expansionary. So I've got a conservative appetite, a neutral appetite, an expansionary appetite. It's important to help the organisation know what these signals mean. And then by risk type, because you can have, I've seen some appetite statements recently. So you go onto websites that says, our appetite is conservative. And you go, well, that's interesting because you're doing all of these activities and you're in this industry that is pretty risky. What does that mean? So then when you drill down and you look at the risk types, it's far from conservative. So conservative is what the board felt comfortable with, and then in the background we went and put the real stuff in the sub-documents. The problem with that is that there's a lack of connectivity between the board going, we want to be conservative, we don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper, we don't want to lose money, we don't want to upset anybody, we don't want to hurt anybody, but over here, well, I'm about to go and start this new business in a different jurisdiction, we're going to go into a non-core product, and those two are not aligned, which goes back to that conversational piece. The context, so in what context are you setting this? So some businesses are emerging businesses, some businesses are stable businesses, some businesses might be declining and trying to ramp up. You might be in an ultra-sensitive industry, you might be government, a service entity. Context means everything from a risk appetite perspective. And then there's the limits themselves. As I said, guiding principles. You need to set risk settings, but if you haven't done it and you don't get it done the first time round, I wouldn't get terribly upset about it. I just try and make one principle and setting per risk type, for argument's sake. It's quite hard to get agreement on multiple risk settings per risk type. And then having done all of that, it's got to be monitored, reported and escalated. So this should become the risk reporting to the board. It should frame up any other risk reporting that goes to the board. Because this is about the board's view of the top risks in the organisation and the risks it's prepared to accept, so it wants to know how the organisation is performing against those. So I talked a minute ago about is it qualitative or quantitative. This is just a couple of examples of what you might choose. So qualitative could be, we have a conservative appetite for compliance failures. We have considerable appetite for expanding educational centres in rural and regional Queensland. We want to aggressively pursue a new industrial plant in South Australia. We have no tolerance for loss of life, etc., etc. Whereas quantitative is very much around, well, how much, how many, how few, how little. So less than a 10% chance of a loss each year. You want to maintain your S&P ratings, a debt to equity ratio of better than something. They're all examples of quantitative, and you're all probably financially astute in this room, so you can think of a dozen others. So that was all nice, but what can you guys do about this? So how can internal audit and the audit committee benefit from risk appetite and risk appetite statements? I've sprinkled a few comments throughout the presentation. But basically, risk appetite is an anchor for the organisation. It provides clarity of intent and it drives focus and effort. So what it does is removes the white noise. There's nowhere to hide when you've got a well-defined risk appetite statement. When things are out of appetite, they're out of appetite. That's it. And when that gets reported to the board, there are very clear conversations that are had. So it removes the ducking and weaving that can happen in organisations. It probably sounds like I've been drinking some sort of lolly water before I got here, right? Because that's not how organisations work. It's not easy to get this done, but I can assure you from the examples I've seen on boards that I work on, it does work. It takes a bit of time, but it does work, and it absolutely changes the focus of the organisation and the interaction of management and the board. So don't give up before you get started. So for you, when you're looking at, well, how is the organisation performing, all business activity should be happening within the parameters that are set from the risk appetite down. You don't have to go and try and work it out because it's there. You don't have to set some other arbitrary measures. You don't have to go and find external benchmarks to apply where there's no benchmarks in the organisation because the benchmark is there. So it actually helps you structure your work in a way that delivers much more value from the board. The board will be much more interested in having a conversation around how the organisation's performing within appetite as to whether or not all the petty cash vouchers added up for the month. And you can have a much more engaging conversation as a professional with management and the board, which is really the more important thing for your careers and your development. You get to have a really meaty, meaningful conversation that's going to help the organisation move forward. Now, I know a lot of our work often is looking at what's happened, but more and more it's also about helping the organisation think about how to go forward. And this is how this can help internal audit. And the audit committee, when the audit committee sits there and goes, well, why are things happening the way that they're happening? Why are we seeing all of these things? Or how is the organisation responding to certain market situations? The risk appetite position becomes the linchpin from that, and you can hook everything to that. So inquiry is more targeted, and so I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to change the slide here. So the other thing that it helps drive is this whole issue about risk profile and control environments. So often these heat maps are developed from a bottom-up process as a result of significant effort put into developing risk registers, doing risk assessments, putting in place controls, etc., etc. What they don't measure in the absence of risk appetite is actually, is that where the board wants you to be? Is that the profile the board wants the organisation to have? Would they actually be quite happy if some more things were up in orange and yellow, if we had a more expansionary appetite? So are we actually wasting money trying to drive our risks down into the green zone by putting in place more and more and more and more and more controls so that everything's low risk? Or in fact, are we quite happy to have a little more risk, provided we've got some monitoring systems in place, etc.? So what risk appetite helps you do is contextualise the current risk profile of the organisation in the context of what the board's expectations are, and go and have conversations that say, well, I think what you're telling us is you're actually happy to take on some orange and red, provided we do certain things. So do I hear that to mean you don't want us to keep driving the organisation down into green? You don't want the organisation to spend that committed $50 million on a new set of controls and control measures? That's a very different conversation. You may find they say, oh, no, actually we do want that. But by using the two together, you have a much more meaningful conversation that helps the organisation understand what they're really asking you to do. When you go and produce your reports and everyone goes, oh my God, it's red, we've got to have some more controls, right? Maybe not. Maybe red's okay at that point in time. So from my perspective, as both a former risk and controls professional and as a board member, that is the most important conversation I can have, because it frees up resource. Frees up investment, it frees up people, and it gets people focused where they need to be focused. That's it. And I'll leave time for, hopefully I've left